Namaskaram. Today I'm going to be talking about verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār. In the previous verse, Bhagavan explained what it means to know oneself. He said, "Tānai iritale, tandai aridalam." Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. Tāni rendatradal undīpaṟa, tanmaya nishtei dundīpaṟa. Tāni rendatradal means because oneself, literally means because oneself is devoid of two. It means because we're not two. There are no two selves, one self to know another self. So because what we actually are is just awareness. So it's only by being that awareness that we can know that awareness. We cannot know ourselves as an object of knowledge. So being ourself is tanmaya nishta. That is being established firmly as that. Tanmaya means tatmaya. Tat is referring to Brahman. So this is abiding as the nature of Brahman, you can say. So true knowing is just being what we actually are. And so Bhagavan goes on in the next verse, verse 27, the verse we're going to be talking about today, to clarify more about this, about the nature of this knowing. Not only is knowing ourselves, not knowing ourselves as an object, we're knowing ourselves just by being ourselves, but such knowledge is devoid of awareness of anything else. That is what Bhagavan is implying in verse 27. What he says is, aṟivaṛi-yāmaiyu-um aṭṛa aṟivē, aṟivāhu uṇmai undīpaṟa, aṟivadaṛku oṉṭṛilai undīpaṟa. What that means is, aṟivu aṟiyāmai-y-um aṭṛa aṟivē, the knowledge that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance, aṟivāhu, that is knowledge. In other words, aṟivē aṟivāhu. So only the knowledge that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance is knowledge. The word he uses here for knowledge is aṟivu, which means knowledge in the broadest sense of the term. So here, knowledge means particularly in the sense of awareness. So when he says that knowledge which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance, the knowledge and ignorance that it is devoid of is knowledge and ignorance of anything other than ourselves. So the knowledge which is the aware, or we can say the awareness that is devoid of knowledge or ignorance of anything other than itself, that is knowledge, implying that is real, that is true knowledge, that is true awareness, that is real awareness. That's the first sentence. In the second sentence, he says, "Idu uṇmai." This is real, or this is true. Uṇmai is a nice word in Tamil. The verb ul means to be. So uṇmai is uṇmai. So it's the beingness or isness. It thereby implies what is true or real. So the implication here is that a real awareness is only the awareness that is devoid of awareness or ignorance of anything else. And why is that the case? He explains in the last line, aṟivadaṛku oṇṭṛilai. There's nothing to know. What this implies is that when we know ourselves as we actually are, there is nothing other than ourselves for us to know. We know ourselves just by being ourselves, and there's no other thing to know. The same thing Bhagavan says in Sanskrit. I'll just read the Sanskrit version also. What Bhagavan says in Sanskrit is jnana vājita, ajnana hina chit, jnanam asti kim yatum antaram. What that means is chit, that is awareness, that is jnana vajita, that means deprived of or devoid of jnana. Here, jnana implies knowledge or awareness in the sense of knowledge or awareness of anything other than ourselves. So it's devoid of jnana, and ajnana-hina means devoid of or bereft of ajnana. It's also bereft of ignorance in the sense of ignorance of other things. So that awareness that is devoid of knowledge or ignorance of anything other than itself, that is jnana. That chit, that pure awareness, is jnana. When he says it's devoid of knowledge of or ignorance of anything else, that implies it's pure awareness. Pure awareness means awareness without any object of awareness. It's awareness in its pure condition. That is the awareness that is implied here, is our fundamental awareness of our own existence. And in itself, that fundamental awareness of its own existence doesn't know any other thing. In sleep, when we remain just as I am, we're not aware of anything other than ourselves. Only when we rise as ego in waking and dream do we become aware of other things. So basically, Bhagavan, in the first sentence, Bhagavan is saying the same that he says in the first sentence in Tamil. The second sentence in Tamil is not translated in Sanskrit, but it's implied that this is the real awareness or the real jnana. And then he ends with a question. It's a rhetorical question. Asti kim jnatum antaram? Is there anything to know? Is there another to know? Antaram means, in this context, means another, something other than, is there anything else to know? So this is this, as I say, it's a rhetorical question. The implication is there's nothing other than ourselves to know. So this is saying the same, it's what Bhagavan implies when he says in the last sentence in Tamil, aṟivaɖku oṇḍṛilai, there's nothing to know. That implies nothing other than ourselves to know. That sense of other than ourselves is conveyed in Sanskrit a little bit more explicitly by saying, by the final word antaram. So what Bhagavan is saying in this verse is that knowledge or awareness, we can take awareness here, awareness that is devoid of awareness or ignorance of any other thing. Why does he mention it's not only devoid of knowledge of other things, it's also devoid of ignorance of other things? The reason is knowledge and ignorance are a dyad, they're a pair of opposites. Without one, the other cannot stand. For example, that is the knowledge that we actually are, the pure awareness, is that is something that exists always. It never ceases to exist. So there's never a time when we are not aware. So there is no, there can never be any such thing as ignorance of ourselves. What is generally called ignorance of ourselves is not actually ignorance, it is a wrong knowledge. That is the correct knowledge of the true awareness of ourselves is just I am. But when we rise as ego, we don't cease to be aware I am, but instead of being aware of ourselves as just I am, we're aware of ourselves as I am this or I am that. I am this body, I am this person with such and such a name and such a story and everything. We are identifying ourselves with something other than ourselves. That awareness of ourselves as something other than what we actually are, that is what is called ignorance. But it's not in the ignorance in the sense of not knowing at all. We always know I am, but when we are aware of ourselves as I am this or I am that, we're not aware of ourselves as we actually are. But in the case of objects, we know them or we don't know them. When we know them, we know them either correctly or incorrectly. That's beside the point. Either we know it or we don't know. These two, each one depends upon the other. To understand this idea more more clearly, there are a series of verses in Upadēśa that are very important to consider in this context. This series of verses is 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. These are the five verses in which Bhagavan is talking very specifically about knowing. And he reveals a lot in these 5 verses. So I will go through these now and relate them to what Bhagavan is saying here. In verse 9, what Bhagavan says is, I won't go through the Tamil so in so much detail, but I'll give the gist of it. What Bhagavan says in the first sentence is, dyads and triads exist always holding one thing. Here the word dyads, in Tamil he uses the word irritagal. This refers to pairs of opposites. Irritagal simply means pairs, but in this context it means pairs of opposites. The technical term in Sanskrit for pairs of opposites is dvandva. So examples of pairs of opposites are existence and non-existence, life and death, awareness and non-awareness, knowledge and ignorance, happiness and unhappiness, liberation and bondage. These are all pairs of opposites. Each member of a pair of opposite has meaning only in relation to the other one. Only if there is bondage can there be liberation. That's just one example. Only if there's life can there be death, and so on. Only if there's knowledge can there be ignorance, and only if there's ignorance can there be knowledge. So that's the pairs of opposites. That's what is meant here by irritagal, which we translate in English as dyads. A simple word, yeah, but it needs, dyads can mean many things in English. We need to understand the sense in which it's used here. The other term he uses is upadēśa, which I've translated as triads. Again, just a simple English term, but it needs explanation. Upadēśa is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit term triputi, which is a technical term in Vedanta philosophy. Maybe not only in Vedanta philosophy, maybe also in other systems of philosophy. This triputi means the 3 factors of knowledge, of knowledge of anything other than ourselves. That is, knowledge in the ordinary sense of the term consists of a knower, a means of knowing, and something that is known. These 3 things are what is called the triputi. The Sanskrit terms that are used to describe these are, in some context, they say jnata, jnana, and jnaya. Jnata means the knower. Jnana means knowing. Jnaya means what is known. Another more technical way of describing these is pramata, pramana, and prameya. Pramata is the same as jnata, the knower. Pramana means the means of knowing, and prameya means what is known. There cannot be, nothing can be known without a means of knowing it. So the prameya depends upon the pramana. And there cannot be any means of knowing without a knower. So the pramana depends upon the pramata, the knower. So what Bhagavan says in this first sentence, the literal meaning is, that is, irritagal, mupadēśa, endrum, oṇḍṛu, patri, irupavam, means dyads and triads exist always holding one thing. That's a very literal meaning. The implication is they depend on one thing. What is the one thing that they depend on? It is ego. Ego is the knower. So without a knower, there cannot be any means of knowing. And without the means of knowing, there cannot be anything known. So the the triad of knower, knowing, and known depends upon the knower. The knower is the crucial element on which the other two depend. Likewise, all dyads, all pairs of opposites, such as existence, non-existence, life and death, awareness and non-awareness, knowledge and ignorance, happiness, unhappiness, bondage and liberation, and so on. These are all things that are known. So without a knower, none of these things would be known. So they have a meaning only when there's something to know them. So both dyads and triads depend upon one thing, the ego, that which experiences them, that which knows them, that which is aware of them. And then so this is one of the fundamental principles of Bhagavan teachings, that everything other than ourself depends for its semi-existence upon the semi-existence of ourself as ego. Only when we rise as ego are we aware of other things. In sleep, we don't rise as ego, we just remain with that fundamental awareness, I am, and therefore we are not aware of anything other than I am. In waking and dream, we rise as ego, and as ego we take ourselves to be a form, and consequently we're aware of a myriad of forms. As Bhagavan says in the 4th verse of Upadēśa Undiyār, tānayin uruhu paramattran. If oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If oneself is not a form, who can see their forms and how? So forms, that is, when we see multiplicity, all things that, multiplicity means things that, there are many things, each of which is distinguished from each other thing. Anything that can be distinguished from any other thing is a form, whether gross or subtle. Obviously, the material objects of the world are gross forms. The thoughts, feelings, emotions, they are relatively subtle forms, but they're all forms, but they can be distinguished one from another. So anything that can be distinguished from any other thing is a form. Ego itself, as Bhagavan says in verse 25, is a formless phantom. But ego cannot come into existence without grasping a form, without taking a form to be itself. So when we rise as ego, we project a body consisting of 5 sheaths, which we experience as ourself, and consequently we experience a multitude of forms. That's why Bhagavan says, if oneself is a form, the world and God will be likewise. If oneself is not a form, who can see their forms? That is, who is there to see? If we don't identify ourselves as a form, we remain as pure awareness. When we remain as pure awareness, we're not aware of anything other than ourselves. So if one's self is not a form, who can see their forms and how? He asks 2 questions there in verse 4. Who can see their forms and how? There's no means of knowing other things unless we know ourselves as one among those other things. In dream, for example, we project the whole world full of a multitude of forms, of objects and people and events and thoughts and feelings about those things, and desires and likes and dislikes. All these come into existence as soon as we start dreaming. But we in a dream, we always experience ourselves as a part of the dream. We projected a dream world in which we are there in the dream world as a person, as a body. So though we are the one who has projected the dream world, we seem to be a part of our own projection. So this is, as I say, this is one of the fundamental principles of Bhagavan teaching. Everything depends on ego for its semi-existence. This is expressed by him most emphatically in verse 26 of Upadēśa Undiyār, āhum. If ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. Here, everything means everything other than ourselves, everything other than that fundamental awareness I am that we always actually are. So if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. If ego doesn't exist, everything doesn't exist. ego itself is everything. That is, when we rise as ego, what we see is this, all this multiplicity, this world, both the external world, the seemingly physical world, and also the internal world, the mental world. All these are nothing but ourself. Just as in dream, what are we seeing as that dream? We're only seeing ourself. That whatever we experience in the dream doesn't exist independent of our perception of it. So we are seeing ourselves as that dream. Likewise, according to Bhagavan, our present state is just a dream. So what we are seeing as this world is nothing but ourselves. That's why Bhagavan says, ego itself is everything. That is, when we rise as ego, we see ourselves as all this. So the substance that we are seeing as all this is nothing but ego, or mind, we can say. So it's our own mind we are seeing as all this world. And then he concludes that verse 26 by saying, Adalal yadu idu endu nadale ovadal yavamena all. Therefore, investigating what it is giving up everything. Why is it giving up everything? Because everything depends upon ego, and if we investigate ego, it will subside and disappear. As he says in the previous verse, that verse 25, he said, Tedinal otum pidicum. If sought, it takes flight. So we seem to be ego only so long as we're attending to things other than ourselves. If we try to attend to ourselves, we can't find any such thing as ego. There's no such thing to be found. We seem to be ego only when we're looking away from ourselves. When we look at ourselves, we don't find any ego. So the way to bring about the dissolution of ego is to look at it very carefully. If we mistake a rope to be a snake, the only way to get rid of that snake, to kill that snake, is to look at it very carefully. We can take a stick and beat it, but we're not going to kill it because it's not a snake. So however much we beat it, it will still be, we can't destroy it by beating it. The only way to destroy that snake is to look at it very carefully. If we look at it very carefully, we'll see, oh, it's just a rope. It never was a snake. Likewise with ego, the only way to destroy ego is to look at it very carefully. If we look at it very carefully, we'll find there never was any such thing. Since ego never existed, nothing else ever existed. So the ultimate truth is ajata. That what is alone is as it is. It is ekameva advityam, one only without a second. That is the ultimate truth. So what Bhagavan refers to in the final sentence of verse 26 of Upadēśa, therefore investigating what it is giving up everything. That is also implied in verse 9. This is the verse about the dyads and triads that I was talking about. As I said, in the first sentence, he said dyads and triads depend on one thing, namely ego. And then he says in the next sentence, if one sees within the mind what that one thing is, they will slip off. Why is that? Because that one thing is ego. If we look within to see what is that one thing, ego will disappear, and everything that depends upon ego will disappear along with it. That is, without the knower, there cannot be any means of knowing, nor can there be anything known. And if there's nothing known, then there are no dyads and triads, because dyads and triads are all objects of knowledge. And then he says, only those who have seen the reality. What that implies is only those who have thus seen the non-existence of ego only they have seen uṇmai, what is real, what actually exists. And then he says, Kalangare Khan, see, they will not be confused. So this is what Bhagavan says in verse 9. So the main point in verse 9 is that all our knowledge of anything other than ourselves is entirely dependent upon our existence as ego. Regarding, just one more thing to clarify about this verse, the middle member of the triad, the pramana, the means of knowing. There are many means of knowing. That is, one means of knowing is sensory perception, seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling. These are one means, but there are 5 different means of knowing. But they're one type of knowing, that is perception. But we know things by other means. We know things, for example, by inference. Things that we don't know directly, we can infer, whether deductively or inductively. We infer so many things that we know. We don't know directly, we know by inference. We also know many things only by belief in testimony. For example, what we learn about history or about science. Most of these things, we've got no direct experience of these things. We take it on trust. What is written in the history books, we believe. We know it may not be entirely correct, but at least there'll be a certain amount of truth in it. Likewise, what we know about what's going on in the world, the news. We know that the newspapers and the news channels on television, they may not always be, they may be reporting things in a biased way, but there's at least some truth in what they're saying. When they're talking about, when they say there's a hurricane that has swept through the east coast of America, and it's caused flooding in New Jersey and New York and so on. We don't have direct experience of that. We take it on. We believe the testimony. So also with religious beliefs, for example, we are told that there's God and that there's heaven and that there's hell, and if you do good things, you'll get good results. If you do bad things, you'll get bad results. All these things we take on trust. So these are all different means of knowing. So this triad covers the whole of all human experience, all human knowledge is included in this. And as Bhagavan points out, it all depends on one thing and one thing alone, that is ego. So this is a fundamental, that's why he says in verse 26, if ego comes into existence, everything comes into existence. All our knowledge, all our science, all our history, our geography, our politics, our religion, everything comes into existence only when we rise as ego. When we don't rise as ego as in sleep, there's no politics, no religion, no philosophy, no science, no history, no geography. There is just pure being and awareness. So ego is the root of everything. This is what Bhagavan is constantly stressing. Why does Bhagavan constantly stress this? For a very practical reason. Because all problems arise only with ego. So in order to and so long as there is ego, there will inevitably be problems. When we rise as ego, we take a body to be ourself. This body brings so many problems. First, we have to undergo the discomfort of birth, then the problems of growing up, and then the problems of taking on responsibility and having a family and having a job and all these responsibilities. And then after some time, the body begins to get old and infirm and diseases come, and eventually it ends in death. So there's life in a body is a constant, is an endless stream of fluctuating problems of one sort or another. Even when things seem to be going relatively well, we still have problems. Even if I've got enough money today, is my money going to last me? Even if I'm free of disease now, how long is my health going to last? That is embodied existence. Samsara is a series of problems, fluctuating. Sometimes we face more problems than at other times. Sometimes life seems more bearable at other times, but there are problems. So whatever we experience, that is all of samsara, and all that we experience in samsara, it's all based on one thing and one thing alone, namely ego. Because we have risen as ego, all these problems we face. So, and what is the nature of ego? The nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by grasping form. Upadēśa Undiyār, grasping form, it comes into existence. Upadēśa grasping form, it stands. Upadēśa Undiyār, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. Upadēśa leaving form, it grasps form. So long as we are grasping form, so long as we are attending to anything other than ourselves, because all forms are other than ourselves, but ego itself is a formless phantom, as Bhagavan says. So ego is a formless phantom, but cannot come into existence without grasping form. So all forms are things other than ourselves. Even this body, this form of 5 sheaths that we take ourselves to be. 5 sheaths means the physical body, the life, the mind, the intellect, and the will. All these, though now they seem to be ourselves, they're actually other than ourselves, because we know them all as objects. So, so long as we are attending to anything other than ourselves, in other words, so long as we're grasping form, we are thereby nourishing and sustaining ego. Upadēśa Undiyār, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. But if instead of grasping other things, if we try to grasp ourselves, in other words, if we try to see what we ourselves actually are, it takes flight. That is, this ego has neither any form of its own nor any substance of its own. That's why Bhagavan says it's a formless phantom. It's formless because it's got no form of its own. It's a phantom because it's got no substance of its own. Thus, its substance is that fundamental awareness I am, which doesn't belong to ego. It is usurped that from, it is misappropriated from Sat-Chit, that fundamental awareness I am, and it's misappropriated the form of a body and conflated both of these and taken them to be itself. In other words, it is Chit, Jada, Granti. It is that not formed by the entanglement of Chit and Jada. Chit means the pure awareness, that's Sat-Chit. Jada means what is not aware. In other words, this body consisting of 5 sheaths, which are all Jada. So ego seems to exist only so long as it's attending to other things. When it tries to attend to itself, it will subside and dissolve back into its source. So Bhagavan has diagnosed what is the root cause of our disease, a disease of embodied existence. The root cause is ego. The root cause of samsara is only ego. That's why in verse 24 of Religion Aptu, when Bhagavan describes ego as Chit Jada Granti, Bandham, it's the Chit Jada Granti, the not formed by the entanglement of Chit and Jada. It's Bandham, bondage, Nupamai, the subtle body, Ichamsaram, this samsara. So according to Bhagavan, samsara is nothing but ego. Samsara is just that is it, the seed that gives rise to samsara, the substance of samsara is only ego. So everything depends upon ego, and the nature of ego is such that if we investigate it, it will cease to exist. But so long as we don't investigate it, so long as we continue attending to other things, it flourishes and gets on fine. Even when we cease being aware of other things, without investigating ego, as happens every day when we fall asleep, what happens? We don't thereby annihilate ego. Ego goes into hiding. We remain in a state of manolaya that we call sleep, and again we pop up again. So our aim is not manolaya, our aim is manonasa. Manonasa, we need to eradicate ego. And for ego to be eradicated, we as ego need to see what we actually are. Only when we see what we actually are will ego, which is a false awareness of ourselves, be destroyed. So when Bhagavan emphasizes that everything depends upon ego, he does so for a very practical reason, that the solution to all problems is to investigate and thereby eradicate this ego. So that's verse 9. That is the introduction to, as I say, this series of, it's the first of these series of 5 verses, and it introduces the next 4 verses. the next 4 verses, Bhagavan is takes one of the dyads, the dyad of knowledge and ignorance, awareness and non-awareness, and deals with it more thoroughly. What he says in verse 10 is, aṟiyāmai-y-um, aṟivu indram. Leaving ignorance, knowledge does not exist. Aṟivu vittu of aṟiyāmai-y-um āhum. Leaving knowledge, that ignorance does not exist. What does he mean here? When he says leaving, it's vittu is an adverbial participle. It literally means leaving. It's often used in the sense of without. So the implied meaning here is without ignorance, knowledge doesn't exist. Without knowledge, ignorance doesn't exist. The knowledge and ignorance he's talking about here is the pair of opposites. Each member of a pair of opposite has meaning only in respect of the other one. Why does he say that knowledge doesn't exist without ignorance and ignorance doesn't exist without knowledge? Only when we come to know something do we come to know that we were previously ignorant of it. For example, before we went to school, there were many things we didn't know. After we went to school, we learned so many things. And since then, throughout life, we've been learning so many things. Whatever we know now, we know that I know this now, but I didn't know it previously. So, and we also know, though I know it now, there's going to be a time when I leave this body, I'm going to forget all this. So, whatever knowledge we have of anything other than ourselves, it is surrounded by ignorance of those things. That is, previously, what we know now, we were previously ignorant of. And later on, we're going to be ignorant of it. We need not even wait till death to be ignorant of it. As soon as we fall asleep, we become ignorant of all these things. So, the knowledge cannot exist without ignorance, and the ignorant, and he says, without the knowledge, the ignorance doesn't exist. What does that mean? There's a very simple reason for that, reason why Bhagavan says this. Nothing exists independent of our awareness of it, of our knowledge of it. So only when we come to know something does our prior ignorance of it come into existence. For example, consider what's happening in the world. A year ago, we didn't know that the Taliban was going to take over control of Afghanistan within a year. Now we know that. Now we know that we were ignorant of that. We didn't know we were ignorant of it until we came to know it. Because a year ago, we couldn't even say we were ignorant of the fact, because it was neither possible to know it or to not know it, because at that time that hadn't happened. So whatever the ignorance of something comes into existence only when we come to know it. Or with science. Now, science is always making new discoveries. We come to know of whatever science has discovered, we come to know that we were previously ignorant of those things only when we come to know them. We can't know our ignorance of something without knowing. It's only when we know something, or at least have some knowledge of something, that we know that we were previously ignorant of that thing. So, according to Bhagavan, knowledge and ignorance of things other than ourselves are a dyad. Each depends upon the other. Neither can exist without the other. So that's the meaning of this. So this is the knowledge and ignorance that he's referring to in these two sentences, is the knowledge and ignorance he refers to in verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār, when he says, only the knowledge that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance is true knowledge. So then he goes on to say, in the next sentence of verse 10, verse 10 of Ramanuja, that is, Anda aṟivum aṟiyāmai-y-um yaṟivāhu oṉṭṟu muḍlam tanne aṟiyum aṟivē aṟivu. That means only the knowledge that knows oneself, who is the first, as to whom that knowledge and ignorance is knowledge. That is only the obvious meaning of that is only self-knowledge, only knowing ourselves alone is true knowledge. How do we know ourselves? By investigating to whom are this knowledge and ignorance. He refers to, he says here, muḍlam tanne, oneself who is the first. Here, what he refers to as tanne is ego, because to whom are knowledge and ignorance? They're only to ego. For our real nature, there's no knowledge and ignorance. It's only when we rise as ego that we either know other things or don't know them. When we don't rise as ego, there's nothing else for us to know or to not know. As he says in verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār. So what does he mean by knowing ego? When he talks about tanne aṟiyum aṟivē, the awareness that is aware of oneself, what he means is the awareness of the reality of ourself. Ourself here means ego. What is the reality of ourself? Is only that fundamental awareness I am. So only that awareness that is aware of itself as just I am, by investigating to whom are knowledge and ignorance, that alone is real knowledge. So the words Bhagavan uses here are very, very simple, but they're very, very deep in meaning. Some people, in some English translations of this verse, they have translated the word tanne as self with a capital S. Only the knowledge that knows the self, which is the first, by investigating to whom are knowledge and ignorance. That is not quite what Bhagavan means. To whom are knowledge and ignorance? Only to ego. If we know, knowing ego means knowing the reality of ego. When we know the reality of ego, we know that ego as such doesn't actually exist. So it is, when Bhagavan is talking about knowing oneself, that is, we have to understand, for example, in verse 14 of Uṇmai, Bhagavan expresses it very nicely. He says, if the first person exists, second and third persons will exist. If one's self-investigating the reality of the first person ceases to exist. So when we're investigating ourselves, we're investigating the reality of ourselves. That is, superficially we're investigating ego. But what we're actually investigating is the reality of ourselves. Just as if we look at the illusory snake, we seem to be looking at a snake. But if we look at it carefully enough, we'll see that what we were actually looking at is only the reality of the snake, namely the rope. So the great care needs to be taken when translating these verses and when interpreting these verses, because otherwise, if taken superficially, this could seem to mean that knowledge and ignorance, particularly if we translate it self with a capital S, it could seem that, oh, knowledge and ignorance are there for the self, for our real nature. That is not what Bhagavan means. Knowledge and ignorance are only for ego. And if we investigate ego and thereby know its reality, knowledge and ignorance will cease to exist, and what will then remain, that is the real awareness. So in this verse, Bhagavan clearly concludes by, but only the knowledge that knows our own the reality of ourselves, that's only when we know what we actually are, is that alone is real knowledge, true awareness. Then he continues the same idea in verse 11. He says, aṛivurum tanne aṛiyādu, ilai aṛivadaɖu aṟiyāmai. Not knowing oneself, who knows, oneself who knows here means ego. The ego is, but knows all other things. So not knowing oneself who knows, knowing other things, ilai, aṟivadaɖ, aṟiyāmai is ignorance. So knowing anything other than ourselves is ignorance, Bhagavan says. Aṟivu. In this context, it's very difficult to convey the exact meaning of aṟi. Literally, it means besides, is it knowledge? That means that if it was not a question, if it were put in a non-interrogative form, that the implication of this is knowing other things without knowing oneself is not knowledge, but only ignorance. That's the implication. So that's the sense in which he's using aṟi as not this, but only this. But in an interrogative sentence, it's very difficult to adequately translate aṟi in this context. There's no exact equivalent in English. But the implication is that knowing anything other than ourselves is only ignorance and not knowledge. It's not knowledge, but only ignorance. So that but only is what is implied by the aṟi. But because it's in interrogative form, we can't exactly convey that. We can't use those terms, those exact terms in English. Then in the next sentence he says, aṟivu ayaku ādara tanne aṟiyā. That means when one knows oneself, who is the basis, the ādara, for knowledge and the other. The other here means ignorance. So only when one knows oneself, who is the basis for knowledge and ignorance. What is the basis for knowledge and ignorance? Only ego. So again here, when he says when one knows oneself, it implies when one knows the reality of ego, which the reality of ego, that is the ādara of knowledge and ignorance, is ego. When we know ego, knowing ego means knowing the reality of ego. So that we need to clearly understand that what Bhagavan isn't saying. Of course, the ultimate ādara is only our real nature, because what is the ādara of ego? It's only our real nature. But what Bhagavan is always emphasizing is that the ādara of all other things is only ego, because it's only in the view of ego that all other things seem to exist. So when he's talking, the implication here is when one knows the reality of ego, which is the ādara, the basis, the ground of knowledge and ignorance. And ego is ground of knowledge and ignorance. When we know the reality of this ego, aṟivu aṟiyāmai-y-um, knowledge and ignorance will cease to exist. So when we know what we actually are, knowledge and ignorance will cease to exist. That's why Bhagavan says in verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār that the knowledge which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance alone is real knowledge. Because so long as there's knowledge and ignorance, to whom are knowledge and ignorance? Only to ego. So long as we are aware of ourselves as ego, we are not aware of ourselves as we actually are. So only the pure awareness that is devoid of both knowledge and ignorance of other things is real awareness. And how to experience that? Only by investigating ourselves, thereby bringing about the dissolution of ego. When ego ceases to exist, its knowledge and ignorance will also cease to exist. That is the implication here. So Bhagavan is constantly stressing this, but the way to be that all other things seem to exist only so long as we rise as ego. If we investigate this ego, if we know what we actually are, knowledge and ignorance which depend upon ego will thereby cease to exist. And what will then remain, that alone is pure awareness. And then we come to verse 12, in which Bhagavan says much the same as he says in verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār. That is, he composed Upadēśa Undiyār in 1927, and Uludran after about a year later in 1928. So we can take this verse 12 as an expansion of what he says in verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār. The first sentence is almost exactly the same. That is what he said in the first sentence of Upadēśa Undiyār is aṟivu aṟiyāmai-y-um aṭṭra aṟivē aṟivāhu. Only the knowledge that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance is knowledge. In this verse, verse 12 of Uṇmai, he says, aṟivu aṟiyāmai-y-um aṭṭra aṟivahu, aṟivu āmai. That means only that which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance is actually knowledge. So that which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance implies that awareness which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance alone is real awareness. Then in the next sentence he says, arium adu uṇmai aṟivu ahadu. That which knows is not real knowledge. What does he mean here by that which knows? He's referring to ego. What he means here, that which knows anything other than itself is the implication. So what's it that knows other things? It is only ego. And ego is not real knowledge. That is what he implies here. It's uṇmai aṟivu ahadu. It's not real knowledge. Then comes a very, very deep sentence. Aṟivaɖku, aṟivitaku, ānyam indrai, aṟivadaṛ, tan aṟivāhu. Since it or oneself shines without another for knowing or for causing to know, oneself is knowledge. That is, we ourselves have a true knowledge of a pure awareness. Why? Because what we actually are, here oneself is referring to our real nature. Because he says, since it or one shines without another for knowing or for causing to know. What's it that shines without another? It's only our real nature. What we actually are, when we rise as ego, there seem to be so many other things. When ego dissolves back into its source and we remain as we actually are, there is no other. So our real nature is always shining without another, either for knowing or for causing to know. That is, there's nothing. This is what he says in the last sentence of verse 27 of Upadēśa Undiyār. Aṟivadaṛku oṉḍru ilai. There is not anything for knowing. Or in the Sanskrit version, asti kim yatam antaram. Is there any other thing to know? In other words, is there anything other than awareness for awareness to know? Pure awareness. There's nothing other than pure awareness, so there's nothing for it to know. As we actually are, what we actually are is just pure awareness. And since that pure awareness shines without another, for either to know or for causing to know, or causing to be known, it's aṟivitaku can be interpreted in several ways. It can mean either for causing to know, that is either for causing itself to know something else, or something else to know it, or something else to know something else, or causing to be known. There's nothing other than it for it to cause to be known. So there's no world for it to cause to be known. There's nothing other than it. So the important point Bhagavan emphasized here is there is nothing in the state of pure awareness. There is no other to know or to make known. Therefore, that pure awareness alone, that pure awareness which we actually are, that alone is aṟivu. That alone is the true awareness. And then he says, pāraṇḍru. It is not a void, or one is not a void. That is, oneself is not a void. The Tamil word pār, it's used here as a, pār means dissolution, emptiness, nothingness, non-existent. it's used here as it's a Tamil equivalent of the Sanskrit word sunyam. So this is indirectly Bhagavan is repudiating the idea of certain Buddhist philosophers who claim that the ultimate reality is void. Exactly what they mean by that is not very clear, but Bhagavan says, no, it is not void, because according to Bhagavan, it is the fullness of pure awareness. It is void in the sense that it's devoid of all other things, but it's not what the Buddhist philosophers say. It's not svabhava sunya. It's not devoid of its own nature, because awareness alone is svabhava. That alone is what is our real nature. And there's nothing other than that. So it's devoid of other things, but it's not devoid of svabhava. It's not devoid of a true nature. And then in verse 13, he summarizes all this, what he said in the previous 4 verses. Jnanamam tane me. Oneself who is jnana alone is real. Jnana in this context means awareness, implying pure awareness. So oneself who is pure awareness alone is real. Nanavam jnanam ajnanamam. Jnana, which is nana. Nana means diverse, various, many. So awareness that is many or manifold is ajnana, is ignorance. So knowing anything other than ourselves is ignorance. It's the implication here. In an earlier version of this verse, Bhagavan, when he first wrote this, that is, on the same day he wrote this, he again modified it in order to pack more into it. So before modifying it in order to pack more into it, what he refers to here as nana vamyanam, he referred to as nana vaikānkindra-jnanam. That is, what he said is jnanam oṇḍṛu uṇmai, nana vaikānkindra-jnanam ajnanam. It went on like that. So what is ajnana? It's nothing but the knowledge that sees as many. Nana vaikānkindra means the knowledge that sees, or the awareness that sees as many. That is, what actually exists is only ourselves, who are pure awareness. The awareness that is aware, that sees this one thing as many things, that is ignorance. So what is the awareness that sees the one as many? It is only ego. So Bhagavan is indirectly here saying ego is ignorance. The ego, that ego in whose view many things seem to exist, that is ignorance. And then he goes on to say, poyam ajnanamai, even that ignorance which is unreal, jnanamam tanne andri indru, doesn't exist apart from oneself, who is jnana. So that is, even this knowledge of multiplicity, which is ignorance, couldn't exist without the fundamental knowledge, the fundamental awareness I am. Without that fundamental awareness I am, which is pure awareness, awareness of other things couldn't exist. And then to illustrate this, he gives, or to make this idea more clear, he gives an analogy. Anigal tam palavam poi. The multiplicity of ornaments is unreal. Mayam ponne andri undo. Do they exist apart from gold, which is real? Of course, gold is not ultimately real. This is for the analogy, that is, ornaments have no existence apart from gold. So, because their substance is gold. If you take away, if you've got, say, a gold bangle, and you take away the gold, no bangle remains. That gold, you can melt it and you can make it into a ring, or you can make it into a necklace, or you can make it into a bangle or a crown, or just a block of gold, whatever. So the substance is, relatively speaking, what is real. The ornaments are just forms. So there are multiplicity of forms which are unreal. Do they exist apart from gold? So just like gold is the one substance that appears as many ornaments, jnanamam tane, oneself alone, who is jnana, is the one substance that appears as all this multiplicity. It appears as subject and object. It appears as the knower and the known. In fact, it appears as all the whole entire triputi. The knower, the means of knowing, and the known, all are nothing other than oneself, who is knowledge. So Bhagavan, indirectly, what he's referring to here when he talks about nanavam jnanam, the knowledge which is many, he's referring back to verse 9, in which he spoke about the triputi. The triputi is an awareness that is split into three: a knower, a means of knowing, and, or rather, one knower, many means of knowing, and many things that are known. All those many things that are known depend upon whatever is the means by which they're known. And all the various means of knowing depend upon the knower. So when we investigate ourselves and know what we actually are, knowledge and ignorance, that the ego will cease to exist, all its knowledge and ignorance will cease to exist, and that state that is that awareness that remains, and which is consequently devoid of knowledge and ignorance, that alone is true awareness. Uṇmai, that's what Bhagavan is saying in verse 27. Aṟivu, aṟiyāmai-y-um, aṭṭra, aṟivē. Only the awareness that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance. In other words, the awareness that is devoid of ego. Because knowledge and ignorance exist only in the view of ego. So only that knowledge that is devoid of ego and all its knowledge and ignorance about other things, that alone is real awareness. This is uṇmai-y-um. This alone is what is real. Why? aṟivadaṛku oṉṭṛilai. There's nothing else to know. So what actually exists and what is only that fundamental awareness, I am, which is pure awareness. Awareness that is devoid of awareness or ignorance of anything else. So it's devoid of, that is, in waking state, we know many things, and we also don't know many things. In sleep, we remain as pure awareness, so it cannot be said that in sleep we either know or we don't know, because there's nothing other than ourselves either to know or not to know. So sleep, according to Bhagavan, is a state of pure awareness. The only defect in sleep, or the only shortcoming in sleep, is not a defect in sleep itself. The defect is that we come out of sleep again. That is, when we're in sleep, we're in our pure state. But because the ego hasn't been annihilated, though it has temporarily subsided in Manolaya, it will sprout up again. So our aim is not just to sleep. Our aim is to sleep eternally. In order to sleep eternally, in the sleep of pure awareness, which is our real nature, and which is the state that we are always actually in, we need to investigate ourselves. When we investigate ourselves, we thereby see the non-existence of ego. When ego ceases to exist, all its knowledge and ignorance ceases to exist, and what then remains, that pure awareness that is devoid of both knowledge and ignorance, that alone is real knowledge. That alone is uṇmai. That alone is what actually exists, because there's nothing else to know. So Bhagavan has, though this seems to be such a simple verse, there's so much packed into this that the very core of this verse is touching upon the very core of Bhagavan's teachings. All knowledge of other things, people often think, oh, after I attain self-knowledge, then I'll continue to know the world, because after all, we can see Bhagavan. Bhagavan is there. Bhagavan sees the world. So we can't say that the jnani doesn't see the world. Bhagavan says the jnani, firstly, the jnani is not the body and mind that we take him to be. The jnani is just jnanamai-y-um. Bhagavan often say jnana alone is the jnani. And so Bhagavan said, the body and mind of the jnani exist only in the view of the ajnani. Likewise, all the jnanis knowing or not knowing other things, all exists only in the view of the ajnani. In the view of the jnani, there is only jnana. There is nothing else to know. So Bhagavan clarifies here that our aim is not some state in which we continue to know all these things, but the state in which we have put an end to ego, which is a basis of the entire dream of multiplicity. That's all. This is nothing but a dream. This dream exists only in the view of the dreamer. Who is the dreamer? It is only ego. If we investigate ego, ego will cease to exist. The entire dream will come to an end, and what will then remain, that awareness that is devoid of knowledge and ignorance of other things, that alone is the real awareness. That alone is the reality.
Thank you, Michael.
Sorry, I haven't left much time for questions, but that is to explain this verse adequately in the context of Bhagavan's teachings. It's necessary to read it in the context of all these other verses.
Right. Thank you. So I will turn it over to questions now. If anyone has any questions pertaining to this verse, please put it on the chat box, and we'll post it to Michael in order received. If you prefer to be anonymous, you can send it as a private message to me. I'm going to start with Keva first. Keva, go ahead.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
Michael, I've got two questions, if you don't mind.
Right.
Questions number one. The universe that we see in the waking states with its multiplicity of name and forms, who created it? With analogy in the dream, we also see a universe with its name and forms. And we also create ourselves as part of the dream. The universe that we see in the dream, who created it? Is that we as a person, as the part of the universe, who created it or projected it? Or there are some other powers beyond we as a person in the dream?
That is, obviously the person we seem to be in the dream cannot have created the dream, because that person is a part of the creation. The creation cannot be created by part of itself. So obviously the person we seem to be in a dream is not what has created this universe. What has created this universe is ego, that I that is aware of itself as I am this person. That is, while we are experiencing dream, we experience ourselves as if we were a person in the dream. But that person we seem to be in a dream is not what we actually are. That is, the dreamer is not the person, it is the ego that takes that person to be itself. So the creator of this world is only ego. It's not, I can't say, oh, Michael has created this world. That would be absurd. Michael is just a part of this world. But the I that is aware of itself as I am Michael, that is what has created this world.
So, for
Exactly.
example, if I am aware of myself as Keva in the dream, taking another body,
Yes.
and I am also an ego in that dream that takes the body of Keva to be me.
You are only one thing. That is what, there is the ego. The nature of ego is always to take itself to be a body. So that which is aware of itself as I am this body, that is ego. It is not the body that has created the world. It is that which is aware of itself as I am that body which has created the world.
But there is also an ego in the dream that takes that body named Keva to be itself.
Yes.
So is that ego that takes the body Keva to be itself that create the universe that the Keva's dream see in the dream?
Keva is not seeing anything. It is the same ego that takes itself to be Keva that is seeing the universe. But because you're aware of yourself as I am Keva, it seems to you that Keva is seeing the world. It is not. Keva is the name of a person. That person consists of what? Body, life, mind, intellect, and will. This is what makes up Keva. But there is something separate from these 5 sheaves that takes these 5 sheaves to be itself. That I that takes these 5 sheaves to be itself, that is what has projected this, and that is what is perceiving it. In fact, projection and perception are not 2 different things. Because where have we projected all this? Only in our own awareness. So our awareness of we don't first project the dream and then perceive the dream. We perceive that is the projection of the dream and the perception of the dream are one and the same, because it's a projection within our own awareness, within our own perception, so to speak.
Does the ego that projects the universe in the dream presence in the dream, or it is actually outside of the dream, then projected it?
It is that in which the dream is occurring. That is, the dream doesn't exist outside. So long as we're dreaming, because we seem to be a person in the dream, the universe seems to be outside ourselves. But as soon as we wake up, our identification with that dream body is broken, and then we recognize, oh, it was all in my own mind. In other words, it was in myself. So the entire dream occurs within the dreamer. The dreamer is not in the dream. The dream occurs within the dreamer, but the dreamer mistakes itself to be a person within its dream. Is that clear?
Yes. One more question.
That is important to understand. That which projects and that which perceives is the same. It is ego. It is not the person that we seem to be, because the person we seem to be, the body, the life, the mind, the intellect, and the will, these are all objects of perception. They are not the perceiver. So the perceiver is only ego. So when Bhagavan talks about the triad, the triputi, the body, mind, that is body, life, mind, intellect, and will, these all belong to what is known. They don't belong to a knower. The knower is only ego. But ego mistakes itself to be those objects that it knows. This is what is called drik drisya viveka. We need to distinguish the perceiver from what is perceived. Whatever is an object of perception cannot be the perceiver. So this body is obviously an object of our perception. This mind, with all its thoughts and memories and perceptions and so on, it's an object of our perception. This the prana, the breathing and the heartbeat and everything, all objects of perception. The intellect, with all its reasoning and its distinguishing this from that, it's all an object of our perception. It's something experienced by us. Even the will, with all its likes, dislikes, desires, attachments, and so on, and the seeds of those, which are vasanas, they're all objects of perception. So none of those things are ourselves. They are all jada. We who are aware of them are at least we've got an element of chit, but we are not the pure chit, because we mistake ourselves to be these jada objects. So we need to distinguish the one who is aware, the perceiver, distinguish the perceiver from everything that is perceived. Only when we are able to distinguish the perceiver from everything that is perceived, are we then able to turn our attention back to ourself alone. And when we investigate the perceiver then subsides and merges back into its source, and what then remains is pure awareness.
Let me see if I understand it correctly.
Right.
So the universe that we see in the dream is not a projection of the I in the dream, but it is the projection of the I of the waking I.
How many eyes are there? Now you're confusing me. I'm getting confused. I thought there was only one eye.
Yeah, but then the one eye
Yeah.
in the waking state is dreaming, right? The one eye in the waking state is dreaming, creating a dream. And
Yes.
then it takes itself as a dream, as a person in the dream. The I that was in the waking state, now it became the I in the dream state.
It's the same eye.
The
You
same
agree?
I.
Yes, right.
So those creations, the universe that we see in the dream, that is the creations of the I, we as the I in the dream, or the I of the waking state.
It is only one eye. Is it a different eye? If it was a different eye that was experiencing the dream and a different eye that was experiencing the waking, there would be no connection between them. Who is now aware of the waking state? You'll say, I am. Who is it who dreamt and experienced that dream? I did. It's the same I. There is only one I. That one I, so long as that one I identifies itself with adjuncts, whether in this dream or in some other dream, that is ego. That I in its pure condition, without any adjuncts, without any identification, is the pure I, which is what we actually are. But that pure I never dreams anything. It's only ego, the adjunct mixed I, that is dreaming. And that the difference between waking and dream, or rather the difference between one dream and another dream, the adjuncts that we take to be ourselves are different. That is, in dream, your body may be injured, for example, but when you wake up, you find no injury in your waking body. So they're different bodies, but the I that took those two, that at that time took that body to be itself, and now take this body to be itself, is the same I.
Okay. One more question, Michael.
Yes.
In the other paragraph of the Naniyar, who am I, Bhagavan said that the nature of the mind, or the mind is an atiśaya śakti, the powerful that exists in the self. So does it mean it is inherent or intrinsic in the self, or in Atma Swarupa? If it is intrinsic or inherent in Atma Swarupa, how could we eradicate it?
It is not inherent. It just cannot be. That is, it's like saying that the ring is in the gold. That is if you've got gold, it has potential to appear as a ring. But whether it's appearing as a ring, or as a lump of gold, or as a bangle, or as a necklace, or a tiara, it's the same gold. So there's only one there.
Makes sense.
Is that clear?
Well, I don't know.
that is, we need one thing that's very, very important to understand is that there is only one I. Otherwise, if we don't clearly understand that there is only one I, we'll go off hunting for some I other than the I that's what many people say. Oh, I tried to practice this this self-inquiry taught by Bhagavan, but I can't find that I. Who is the I who can't find the I? Which I can't find which I? There's only one I. So long as we don't understand the oneness of ourselves, that we are one, we are not investigating something other than ourselves. Even ego is not other than ourselves, but it is not what we actually are. Just like the snake, is not other than the rope, but it's not what the rope actually is. The rope is not a snake. So that atiśaya śakti is the rope is an the snake we can say is the atiśaya śakti.
Right.
What does it appear in? It appears only in atmasvarupa, which is the rope. So it's not, we shouldn't take it that the mind is inherent in. But if how come the mind disappears every day in sleep? If it was intrinsic, if it was the nature of atmasvarupa to be a mind, the mind would never disappear. The fact that the mind appears and disappears means it is not what we actually are. What we actually are is only that fundamental awareness, I am, that continues in all the three states. Whether you're aware of yourself as this body or that body or no body at all, you're aware of your own existence as I am. That fundamental awareness of our own existence, that alone is what is real. Ego is that fundamental awareness mixed with adjuncts. It's still the same I, but it's not atmasvarupa that is seeing the world. It is only as ego that we are seeing the world. What we actually are never sees anything.
So when Bhagavan said that the mind is an atiśaya śakti that exists in the atmasvarupa,
Yeah.
it doesn't literally means that the mind is real or intrinsic or inherent in the atmasvarupa.
Yeah.
It just seemingly exists in atmasvarupa. Am I right?
Yes. That term atiśaya śakti is referring to Maya. Maya doesn't actually exist, but it cannot exist. That's what Bhagavan says in verse 13. Even that ignorance, the ignorance he's referring to, is that which is aware of multiplicity. The knowledge of multiplicity is ignorance. Even that ignorance, which is unreal, cannot exist apart from oneself, who is real awareness.
Okay, I get it now, Michael. Thank you so much.
Right. Okay, pleasure. Well, good questions, because it's very important we understand these things and we remove all misconceptions, because otherwise, as I say, we'll be thinking in terms of two eyes. There was one eye in dream, another eye in waking, another eye in sleep. What is the connection between all these eyes? They are all one and the same eye. The difference is, in sleep, we remain in our pure condition as just I am. In waking and dream, we seemingly rise as ego, which is a mixed awareness, I am this or that.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you so much.
Right. Pleasure.
Thank you. Let me look at, there's a Sanjay Lohia is asking, is atiśaya śakti another name for ego?
Yes, in this context, that atiśaya śakti is ego. When what Bhagavan says in that paragraph of Nana, he says, that is the fourth paragraph. He says, what is called mind is an atiśaya śakti that exists in atmasvarupa. Adu sakala nene totru vikindrinu. It causes all thoughts to appear. So which is the thought that causes all other thoughts to appear? As he says in the next paragraph, of all manatin tondrum ninebugol elavatrikum, of all the thoughts that appear in the mind, nanenum ninebu mugul ninebu. The thought called I is the first thought, or the root thought, the primary thought. Idu to erinda perehe. Only after this rises, eni nirnibugal erukindrana, do other thoughts arise. So the first thought, the thought that projects all other thoughts, is this first thought called I, that is ego. So when what Bhagavan is referring to, generally when Bhagavan is talking about mind, he's generally talking about ego, because though the term mind is used as a collective term for all thoughts, what the mind essentially is only the first thought I. Because all other, so long as the mind exists, that first thought I is there, because that is the root, the ādhara, the adhisthana, the basis of everything, of all other thoughts. So other thoughts are constantly changing. The one constant thought is that thought called I. When that thought called I subsides, as in sleep, the whole mind subsides. So why is the thought called I the first thought, and why do all other thoughts depend on it? Because the first thought, the ego, is the thought called I, is the subject. All other thoughts are objects. Objects cannot exist without the subject because they seem to exist only in the view of the subject. So when he says it projects all thoughts, he's referring to all other thoughts are projected by this first thought I. And then he goes on to say, Ninevugale ellam niki pakincha podu, if removing all thoughts we see, taniai manamendro koṇḍṟilai. There's no thing separately as mind. Ahayal nineve manatin sarupam. Therefore, thought alone is the nature of the mind. And he then goes on to say about the world. The world is nothing but thoughts. So, thought alone is the nature of the mind, and of all the thoughts of the mind, the first thought is the thought called I, because the first thought, all other thoughts are jada. They're just objects. The thought called I is the only thought that is endowed with awareness. And so it is only in the view of the first thought that all other thoughts appear. In the view of Atma-swarupa, there are no thoughts. There is just, in the view of Atma-swarupa, there is nothing but Atma-swarupa. But when we rise as ego, we are aware of the seeming existence of other thoughts. And the whole world, as Bhagavan says in that paragraph, is nothing but thoughts. So generally when Bhagavan is talking about the mind, he's talking about that first thought I, because that is the essential thought. See the first sentence of paragraph 5. He says, in the day hatil nan enju kalambaradu ejuvo akte manamam. That means whatever it is that rises in this body as I, that alone is the mind. So here Bhagavan is saying that first thought I, that is the mind. That is what the mind essentially is. All other thoughts are just an expansion of this one first thought. That one first thought is seeing itself as all these other thoughts. So what the mind essentially is only this I. That's what Bhagavan says in verse 18 of Upadēśa Undiyār. Yes. Ennangale manam. Thoughts alone are mind. Yavinam, of all, meaning of all thoughts, nanenum enname mūlamam. The thought called I is the root. Why? Because all other thoughts exist only in the view of this first thought I. Therefore he concludes, Yanam manamennal. What is called mind is only I. I here means ego. So what the mind essentially is only ego.
Thank you, Michael.
Does that adequately answer that question?
Yes, please. Yes, please. Thanks, sir.
Okay. Okay, good.
Thank you. So as a follow-up to your question, to your analogy on the gold, there's a question. Using the gold analogy as a ring, don't I need the knowledge of the melting point of gold to dissolve into it?
I don't know the melting point of gold, but if you give me gold and give me a fire, I'll be able to melt the gold. But this is just an analogy. I think you're referring to the dissolution of ego.
Yeah, the point at which
Right.
We get
Okay, right. When will ego disappear? What is ego? Ego is nothing but a false awareness of ourself. It is nothing but that wrong knowledge, I am this body. So the melting point, the point at which this wrong knowledge will melt in such a way that it will never form again, it is that point at which we are aware of ourselves as just I am. In sleep, we are aware of ourselves as just I am, but ego is not thereby destroyed. Why? Because ego went AWOL before we became aware of ourselves as just I am. That is, in sleep we become aware of ourselves as just I am as a result of the dissolution of ego. So ego isn't destroyed. It's not destroyed by that pure awareness I am because it's not absent. It's absent. You can't carry out the death sentence if a person is charged with murder or some crime and is sentenced to death. You cannot carry out that death sentence except in the presence of that person. If that person has gone AWOL, if they escaped from prison or whatever, or they were never caught, that death sentence cannot be carried out until they're caught. So in sleep, we cannot destroy ego because ego first ceases to exist, first dissolves back into its source, and then only does that pure awareness shine forth. So in order to destroy ego, we need to do so in waking and dream when ego is present. And how are we to destroy ego? Only by being aware of ourselves as we actually are. That is, we as ego need to be aware of ourselves as we actually are. That is, we need to be aware of ourselves as pure awareness. But as soon as ego is aware of itself as pure awareness, it ceases to be ego, because ego is not pure awareness, it's the adjunct mixed awareness. So that is why we can destroy ego by turning our attention away from all other things back towards ourselves. It's that turning of attention towards ourselves. Whose attention is it? It's ego's attention. So when ego tries to see itself, it will thereby dissolve in that pure awareness. This is what Bhagavan says in verse 16 of Upadēśa Undiyār. He says, vaṟivē vittu, leave the external phenomena. That is necessary. So long as we are aware of the external phenomena, we cannot be attending only to ourselves. So that is a necessary prerequisite. But though it's necessary, it's not sufficient, because in sleep every day when we fall asleep, we leave external phenomena. So the important part in verse 16, Bhagavan says, manam tan oli uru ordalai. Why does he bring in the mind here? Why is it the mind that needs to see its own form of awareness? The mind here means ego. Only when ego sees its own form of light, in other words, when it sees itself as pure awareness, it thereby dissolves in that, and that is uṇmai. That is the real awareness. So it's necessary for us as ego to see ourselves as pure awareness. Can ego ever see itself as pure awareness? No, it cannot. Because as soon as ego sees itself as pure awareness, it ceases to be ego. So we are undertaking mission impossible. We will never know what we actually are. We as ego will never know what we actually are. But as a result of this mission impossible, we will lose ourselves. That is sufficient. If we lost ego, then what remains is what we actually are. So the aim of Bhagavan's path is that we as ego must know what we actually are. That is an impossible aim, but because as soon as we know what we actually are, we cease to be ego and remain as we actually are. So who is it who is aware of, who is it who attains jnana? It's not ego, because ego ceases to exist. What is jnana means pure awareness. What is aware of pure awareness is only pure awareness. As Bhagavan said, yāmaiyu-um. It is pure awareness alone that knows pure awareness. And pure awareness always knows pure awareness, because it's never in ignorance. So what do we achieve by following Bhagavan's path? That is the aim of all spiritual path is dukkha nivritti, the removal of unhappiness, and sukha prapti, the attainment of happiness. So what do we achieve by following Bhagavan's path? We attain that happiness which we had always, which is ever attained. And we get rid of that misery that never existed. That misery that never existed is ego. Ego itself is misery. That dukkha is ego. But the very nature of ego is to be dissatisfied. That dissatisfaction is ego. So we get rid of that which never existed, and we attain that which always existed. So actually we've attained nothing, and we've lost nothing also. But if we want to describe the goal better, it's better to think in terms of the goal of losing everything rather than gaining anything. Because who is it who gains and loses things? It's only ego. So we need to lose ego itself. When ego is lost, what is ever attained, nitya siddham, remains as nitya siddham.
Thank you, Michael. So I have a question regarding regarding theoretical knowledge, particularly scriptures. So a lot of people in their journey, they read different scriptures, whether it is Christian scriptures or Vedic scriptures, Bhagavad Gita, and so forth, and then they come to Bhagavan, they read Bhagavan's works, and then they practice. What is the role at this point of the prayer scriptures they have read? Whether it is the Upanishads or any of the Gitas or Bhagavad Gita or so forth. And then on the same angle, what is the role of Bhagavan's scriptures in a continuing practice?
Okay.
Yeah. These are not true knowledge, strictly speaking, but they are aids to it. So how does it fit in here?
Okay. Well, I was going to say we can understand this in the light of what Bhagavan says in this verse 27. That is, that knowledge which is devoid of knowledge and ignorance, that alone is true knowledge. The knowledge we gain from books, previously we didn't know what was written in those books. When we read them, we come to know what was written in those books. And when we fall asleep or when we die, we will forget all that we learned. So that is not the real knowledge. We cannot get real knowledge from books. This is what Bhagavan says in verse 16 of Nana. Sorry, paragraph 16 of Nana. He says, Ennulilum muktiya devadaku manate adaka vendum endru solapadu padiyal mano nigrahamai nulgali mudivana karatu ena arindu konda pimbu nulgale alavindri padipadal payanilai. Since in every text, here the text means that it's referring to scriptural text, particularly the scriptural text of Advaita, it is said that for attaining mukti, it is necessary to make the mind cease. After knowing that manonigraha, the cessation of mind, alone is the ultimate intention of all such texts, there is no benefit to be gained by studying texts without limit. For making the mind cease, it is necessary to investigate oneself to see who one actually is. But instead of doing so, how can one see oneself investigating in texts? That is in Tamil, manate aduvartaku tanne ya endru vicharaka vendame alamal epidi nulgalil vicharipadu. How can we we can go on investigating books endlessly, but we can't know what we actually are thereby. Tanne tannudeya jnana kannal tane aṟiyavendam. It is necessary to know oneself only by one's own eye of jnana. Eye of jnana means we ourselves need to be aware of ourselves. We can't, books cannot show us what we actually are. Books can point us in the right direction, but we can't get self-knowledge from reading books. Raman Endrariya Kannadi Venduma. For Raman, this is just a random name. For someone called Raman, to know himself as Raman, does he need a mirror? Do we need a mirror to look at ourselves and say, oh, yes, I'm me? We know who we are. We don't need a mirror to know who we are. And then he says, Tan Panchakosam Galu Irupadu. Oneself is within the 5 sheaves. Mugalo Avatriku Delil Irupave. Books are all outside the 5 sheaves. Ahayal Panchakosangale Niki Vicharaka Vendiye Tanne Sarupate Tanne Nurgalil Vicharipadu Vine. Therefore, investigating oneself in who one should who needs to be investigated by removing the 5 sheaves. Investigating oneself in books is futile, it's useless. Bandatilirakum Tanya Indru Vicharitu Tanya Tata Sarupate Terindu Konde Kolvade Mukti. Investigating investigating who is oneself, who is in bondage, and thereby knowing one's real nature, that alone is mukti. So what is the means? Then Bhagavan gives very, very clearly what is true vichara. That is, if you go to if you listen to lectures on Advaita, most of the lecturers on Advaita will think that there are various prakriyas, various ways of analyzing our experience. We can analyze the 5 sheaves, or we can analyze the 3 states, or we can analyze this or that. These various prakriyas, doing this intellectual, this self-analysis, as taught in the scripture, they take this to be vichara. But Bhagavan says, what is vichara? Sada kalamun manate atmavil Vaitirabhutkutan Atmavicharam Endrupaya. Always keeping the mind fixed on oneself alone is called Atmavichara. So Bhagavan is emphasizing vichara is not, we cannot do vichara in books. That is, books are useful to the extent to which they point us in the right direction. But what are all the books pointing at? When Bhagavan says in verse 32 of Ulidanapu, Adunu Endru Amaragal Artidavum. When the Vedas proclaim that is you, Tanne Edu Endru Tan Tendu Iradu. Instead of oneself knowing oneself as what, instead of investigating what am I, Adunan Idu Andru Endru Ennal Uranmaiyī. It's thinking I am that, not this. In other words, doing all these prakriyas is due to Uranmaiyī. Bhagavan says it very, very strongly. Ilai means non-existent, but due to the complete absence of strength, Endrum aṟivē tanai amavadaṛ, because that alone is always seated as oneself. What is the implication of this? When the Vedas say you are that, what are they pointing at? They're not, that is, till now we were looking for something outside ourselves, whether we call it Brahman or happiness or God or knowledge or whatever we're looking for. We were taking that to be something other than ourselves. So the Vedas say, no, you are that. What does that mean? If I am that, I can forget about that, because once I know that there's no that other than me, there's no God other than me, there's no Brahman other than me, there's no happiness other than me, there's no knowledge other than me. So when it is said you are that, what do I need to do? I need to I need to know myself by investigating what am I, and thereby be what I actually am. That is the implication of this verse. So when we read any text, whether Bhagavan's text or any other text, we need to understand the practical implication of these texts. The problem is we overlook the practical implication, and we begin just getting caught up in the concepts and the ideas, and we go on reading more and more. If now I've understood so much by reading so many books, but if I read more books, then I'll understand more. And if I read more books, I'll understand more. And our life becomes an endless study of books. But we end up not knowing what we actually are because we're looking outside. The books are all outside. But though the books are outside, where are they pointing? Tattvavasi. That they're not pointing at tat. Tat is a subject. They're pointing at tvam. So they're turning our attention away from tat, away from the idea of Brahman or whatever it may be, or happiness or whatever, or God or whatever, away from that idea, back to ourself, what is actually denoted by that word Brahman is nothing other than tvam, you. So turn your attention back to yourself. So that what Atmavichara is, we need to understand the basic principles of Advaita, Bhagavan teachings. We need to understand that we are not this mind, we are not this body, or this prana, or this mind, or this intellect, or this will. We are not anything that appears in waking or dream and disappears in sleep. We are that which is constant throughout all these three things. So we need to have a basic understanding. All these prakriyas are useful to the extent they give us, they're the preliminaries. We need to have a clear understanding of what we are not and what we are. We are not any object. We are the subject. We have that awareness. Even say we have a subject is not actually correct, because we seem to be the subject only in waking and dream. We cease to be the subject in sleep. So we have a ground of the subject, the adhisthana, the adhara of the subject, that pure awareness I am. That is what we actually are. So what do we need to investigate? Only that fundamental awareness I am. Therefore, Bhagavan says, Sada kalamum manate atmavil vaitirabit kutan atmavicharam enjupaya. That alone is what atmavichara is. Dhyānamo tanne satchidananda bhavamaha bhavipadu. Dhyana is considering oneself to be Brahman, who is Satchidananda. That is a mere mental exercise. That is not going to reveal to us what we actually are. And that idea, I am Brahman, I am Satchidananda, that's something that we've learned. So how did Bhagavan conclude this paragraph? Katrave anaitayum orukalate maraka vendi varum. It will become necessary to forget everything that has been learned at one time. At least of a time. We forget every time we fall asleep, we forget everything that we've learned, but then we pop up again in waking, we remember all that we had learned, or we remember some of it. But when death comes, we're going to forget it all. So, merely thinking I am Brahman is just an idea. Does Brahman need to think I am Brahman? As Bhagavan says in Upadēśa, we always need to be thinking I am a man. It's not necessary. We're always aware of ourselves as I am a man. I think in verse 36 or somewhere Bhagavan says that. Yes, in verse 36 he ends by saying, Nan mandidan Nan manidan endru enamo. Does one think I am a man? No, because we know man here, manidan here means a human being. Do we think we're human? No, we don't think, we don't constantly think, in the morning we wake up, what am I? Am I a dog or a cat or a cow or a horse? Oh no, I'm a man. So I must remember I'm a man. It's not necessary to remember that. We know very well we are that. Likewise, Brahman doesn't think I am Brahman. So merely thinking I am Brahman is not it's not the solution. Thinking I am not this body, I am that Brahman is not the solution. What we need to do is to investigate ourselves. And what Bhagavan says here, Bhagavan is drawing out the practical implication of all those countless texts. If we understand the practical implication of those countless texts, we need not go on studying them. So the practical implication is that we should fix our mind, fix our attention always on ourselves. That alone is Atma Vichara. And that is not something new that Bhagavan has brought. Krishna taught this very, very clearly in the Bhagavad Gita, in verses 25 and 26 of the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, which Bhagavan translated as verses 27 and 28 of Bhagavad Gita Saram. Krishna taught exactly this. In verse 25, Bhagavan translated as verse 27, Atma samstam manakritva. Fix the mind only in self. Na kinchit api chintayat. Do not think of anything else. In Tamil, Bhagavan said, Chittate anmavil se tidukar. Fix the mind in self. Maṭṛa ittaniyam ennidade. Do not think even in the slightest of anything else. So this is vichara. This is what vichara means. It's not studying the text maybe studying the text to a certain extent may be a necessary prerequisite. But once we've understood what is the practical implication of the text, that we should investigate what we are. We need to investigate what we are. We can investigate what we are only by fixing our attention on ourselves, by fixing our mind on ourselves. Atma samstam manakritva. Sadakalamam manate atmavil vaitirapadu. That's fixing the mind on ourselves. That alone is Atma Vichara. So all these texts are useful up to a certain point, but we shouldn't be endlessly reading them. And having come to Bhagavan, what is special about Bhagavan's teachings is the emphasis that he puts on practice. Not only does he emphasize the need for practice, he's clarified in so many ways, he's clarified and simplified all that is taught in the older texts. So if we've understood what Bhagavan has written in Upadēśa Undiyār, Nana, and a few other works, there's no need to read any Upanishads, any commentaries, any sub-commentaries or expositions of them. All these are unnecessary because Bhagavan has given us the cream of the cream. The essence of all of Vedanta has been summarized by Bhagavan in just a few short works. And Bhagavan has not only summarized, he's also clarified. For example, in all the old texts, it is said the problem is avidya, ignorance. Bhagavan says, what is ignorance? Ignorance is nothing but ego. This is much more practical because ignorance sounds like it's something other than ourselves. But we ourselves are the problem. That is what is it? What is ignorance? Ignorance is nothing but the false awareness, I am this body. So who is it who has this false awareness, I am this body? It is ego. So ego is the problem. And what is the solution? Only when so long as ego is looking at other things, it perpetuates its seeming existence. So ego needs to investigate itself. So ego is both the problem and it is the solution to the problem. We as ego need to investigate what we actually are. Now, we need to look at ego to see what ego actually is. When we see what that ego actually is, we'll see it's just pure awareness. We cannot experience that pure awareness by reading books because who is reading the books? The ego is reading the books. That ego through intellect through the 5 sheaths, through the eyes and the intellect and so on. These 5 sheaths are instruments by which ego is studying the books. But as Bhagavan says, one's self is not outside. The books are all outside these 5 sheaths. What the books are pointing at is what is inside the 5 sheaths, which is ego. If ego investigates itself, ego is a mixture of what is real and what is unreal. The unreal portion of ego is the upadis. And all the texts say, you are not this body, you are not this mind. So we understand we are not this body and mind. So what is that element of the ego that we need to investigate? Only that fundamental awareness I am. Fixing our attention on that fundamental awareness I am is what Krishna calls Atma Samstam Manakritva, what Bhagavan refers to here as Sadakalamum Manate Atmavil Vaitirapatku. Fixing the mind in oneself, always fixing the mind in oneself. Of course, we all fail, as far as that Sadakalamum, we are all failing. But that is our aim. As constantly as possible, we want to be self-attentive. Whatever else may be happening, whatever else we may be doing, do we not exist? So we can attend to ourselves. We are always exist and we are always aware of our existence. We always know I am. So we just need to know I am attentively instead of negligently. Though we always know I am, our attention is usually on other things. We need to lose interest in other things and take interest only in this fundamental awareness I am. Taking interest in this awareness I am and attending only to this, that is Atma-vichara. And that is what all these texts are pointing at. But if we fail to understand that they're pointing at this, or even if we understand it and don't put it into practice, what is the use of all these texts? Bhagavan can point at the sun and say, look at it. But if we say, oh yes, that's very nice philosophy, but we don't look at the sun, what is the use of the teaching? The teachings are telling us, look at the sun and you'll be blinded. Finish, story over. When ego looks at pure awareness, looks at what it actually is, it is thereby blinded by that, it is swallowed by that, dissolved into that. That's all that is, that's the beginning and the end of the spiritual path.
Thank you, Michael. Keva, go ahead. Here's got one more question.
Michael, I'm sorry, I have one more question.
You're most welcome.
Well, if the Upanishads are very clear, stated that there is only one absolute reality, which is called Brahman, Atman, or Atma-swarupa in the context of Bhagavan teaching, then why did the other so-called enlightened beings or sages like Ramanuja, Madhva, or the founder of this ISKCON or Krishna came up with other ideas like Vishishta Dvaita, or the founder of ISKCON even say that the Vaikuntha or the Krishna is the absolute form of God or the eternal reality. So what is your views on that?
Okay. Advaita is the ultimate, but not everyone will. For example, we were talking about dream. The vast majority of people at any time will not be willing to accept that this world is a dream, because so long as we are attached to this world, it's very difficult for us to, even if we have a superficial level of, oh yes, Bhagavan taught the world is a dream, I believe the world is a dream, but still we go on. If we really understood it's a dream, would our mind still be after it? But our mind is still after it. We're still seeking happiness here and there and everything. So our understanding is very superficial. But there are many people who are not even willing to understand superficially. They just don't like the idea that the world is a dream. So there have to be different levels of teaching given to different people. So the Prasthanatraya, the 3 source texts of Vedanta, are the Upanishads, the Brahma Sutra, and the Bhagavad Gita. These 3 sets of texts can be interpreted in many different ways. Deliberately, they have been written to give room for them to be interpreted in different ways, because they then cater to the needs of people at different levels of their spiritual development. So you can interpret the Upanishads. In fact, there are many portions in the Upanishads that may be easier to interpret in a dualistic or a Vishishtadvaita way. They seem to be pointing more at Vishishtadvaita, but there are other things that are pointing more at Advaita. For instance, Tattvamasi, for us that's very clear, this is Advaita. But they all explain it, that is the Vishishtadvaitins, the Veda Vedantins, the Dvaitins, the Achintya Veda Vedantins, the ISKCON people. They all have their own way of explaining these things. And they'll say, but we're wrong to say that we are Brahman. They'll say, they have their own ways of explaining these things. So it's clear to us that it's clear to us because Bhagavan has pointed out to us that not only do we need to understand, but when it says you are that, it means there's no that other than you. That is the implication. That's how we take it in Advaita. But even then, even people who understand it in that way, they still don't understand the practical implications of that. Bhagavan has highlighted the practical implication. If you are that, you can forget about that. Investigate yourself. Who am I? That is what is required. Why do they say you are that? Because they want to turn our attention away from looking for Brahman outside ourselves to see that we ourselves are Brahman. How to see ourselves as Brahman? We need to investigate ourselves. So the scriptures can be interpreted in many different ways. And it's right and proper that they should be interpreted in different ways, because people need to be gradually, slowly brought to this path. That is why there's a whole diversity of religions. Not only we're talking about Vedanta. Vedanta is just one system of philosophy in Hinduism, in what is nowadays called Hinduism. Hinduism is now identified with the 6 so-called Astika philosophies. But these were only 6 out of the 12. And these are also a random classification. There were innumerable different philosophies to choose from in ancient India. There were Jain philosophy, there were Buddhist philosophy, there were Vedic Vedanta, and different systems of Astika philosophy. There were Charvakas, the materialists. It could be, some accepted the Vedas, some didn't accept the Vedas. There was something to cater for everyone. And outside of India, there were so many other religions, the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. There are so many religions that have since died out. The Aztecs and the Incas, they have their own religions. The Native Americans and the people in Africa, they have their own religions. There were tribal religions. Even now in India, there are still tribal religions. It all broadly comes under the idea of, the very broad umbrella of Hinduism, but there are tribal people in India who have their own beliefs that are quite, though it comes under that broad umbrella of Hinduism, it's actually got nothing to do with the Vedas. They have their own family deities, tribal deities, and so on. So there's innumerable different beliefs and everything there. And in China, they had Confucianism, they had Taoism. All these are to suit people at different stages of spiritual development. So everything has its place. But what we need to decide is what is our aim? That if you go to other religions, they'll have, or even other interpretations of Vedanta. The ISKCON people, they think the highest state is to go to Vaikuntha and be with Krishna. So even the idea of, everyone said they want mukti, but what is mukti? There are so many different ideas of mukti. So we first need to decide what is our aim. If we've been drawn to Bhagavan's teachings, and we understand and we are attracted by what Bhagavan has taught us, which is that ego is the root of all problems, and we can get rid of the ego, we can surrender ego only by investigating it. If this is what appeals to us, this is the right path for us. That doesn't mean we can't expect all other people to be attracted to this. There are so many different paths to suit it to different needs of different people at different times. And we ourselves, we've been through all these things. We've been, in the past, we've been through so many janmas in which we've done all these different, we practiced religion at so many different levels. But now we've come to the level, what Bhagavan is representing is actually beyond all religions. This is taking us to the very ultimate.
So in previous births, maybe Keva was reading Vishishtadvaita or
Maybe. I mean, we don't necessarily all come by the same path. Some of us may have been yogis, some of us may have been bhaktas, some of us, in some lives we may have been Christians, in some lives we may have been Muslim, in some lives we may have been Confucianists or Taoists. So these are all, as Bhagavan says in verse 8 of Arunachal Ashtakam, like the cloud, the rain evaporates from the ocean, that falls as rain, it will not rest till it returns to the ocean. But however many different paths it may take on the way, it may go down this river and it may get caught in this dam, and from there it may be evaporated, it may come again down, falling down this mountain street. There's so many different paths. And like the bird in the sky cannot rest. The only resting place for a bird in the sky is when it comes back to earth. Likewise, and from the river it must return to the ocean. So there's so many different paths, so many different ways. But ultimately, if we want rest, if we've had enough, we need to return to the ocean. And what is the ocean? Tattvamasi. You yourself are that. Know yourself, and you merge back in the ocean. The ocean of infinite being, infinite awareness, infinite love, infinite happiness. You are that. Know yourself and be that.
So the Advaita is actually the resting place, the ocean, or the final truth.
Yes.
it is a cream of
we take it in that way. But if you say that to the Dvaitins, they say, no, I don't want your Advaita. I want to be with Krishna. I want to be with Allah in heaven, or I want to be wherever. So we are not here to criticize the beliefs of others. All beliefs have their own, are appropriate in their own context, in their own time for certain people. But now we have come to this path. For us, this is the ultimate. And there's no coming back. If we merge in the ocean, we're finished. So until we are ready for our own annihilation, we should steer clear of Bhagavan and his teaching. They're very, very dangerous.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Right. Pleasure.
So thank you, Michael.
Right.
So, as you said some time ago, I think Bhagavan's teaching is the cream of the cream of the cream.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Namaskar.
Namaskaram.
Thank you, Mayor. The shower of wisdom.
It's not my wisdom, it's Bhagavan's wisdom. I'm only talking about what Bhagavan said. I am completely devoid of wisdom.